All right, as promised, we're going to shift to domestic politics now, and I'm joined out of the CBD studio in Sydney by the Shadow Communications Minister, Jason Clare. Thanks very much for your company.
Thanks, Peter. Happy New Year.
And to you. We'll get to some of the portfolio issues in the mix, put pretty firmly in the mix last week by Mitch Fifield in a moment. But first, your reaction to the news overnight that Tony Abbott is going to continue his service to the Parliament. His statement made clear he's got a lot of local traffic congestion issues that he wants to get solved in his local electorate.
Well, it's not good for Malcolm Turnbull, is it? Sitting there on the backbench like Banquo's ghost is just going to haunt this Prime Minister until Tony Abbott either decides to go or decides to make another move. Whatever he says will be a distraction and will be reported by the media. And invariably, by staying there in the Parliament, he'll act as a tether on Malcolm Turnbull, drawing him away from the centre of Australian politics towards the radical right of the Liberal Party. The other thing I'd say, Peter, is even though it's not realistic for Tony Abbott to think that he'd ever be Prime Minister again, I think he still thinks that there's a chance. I don't think it's a surprise that the first photograph of Tony Abbott after he lost the leadership was him standing next to a bust of Winston Churchill. I think he thinks this is the wilderness years. People like Corey Bernardi have called other people in the Liberal Party the appeasers. And I think Tony Abbott is hoping that there is a reckoning coming, some great struggle that will force the moderates in the Liberal Party to ask him to come back and lead them again.
Well, we'll find out, but let me ask you this though, if you see similarities by the sounds of it, at least implicitly, with what happened with Kevin Rudd on your side, what about similarities in the contemporary world of politics with Wayne Swan? You've got a former Deputy Prime Minister sitting on the backbench, not just for this term in opposition, but potentially for a second as well. He said he'll go around again. Is he contemplating the same thing? What's the difference?
No, I think there's a big difference between a former Treasurer or a former Deputy Prime Minister and a former Prime Minister. We learnt that lesson well. I think Julia Gillard made the right decision in 2013 when she said if she lost the leadership, she'd leave Parliament. Tony Abbott should have done that as well. The fact that he didn't, I think, is bad news for Malcolm Turnbull. It'll be a distraction, and he'll sit there on the backbench and haunt him until he decides to go.
I don't doubt that it will be at least somewhat of a distraction, certainly for a while, depending on how the polls go. But it is a very different situation, isn't it, to Kevin Rudd? You alluded to that already in terms of saying that you don't think that you can see him coming back as Prime Minister. Kevin Rudd was still ahead on the two-party vote. His personal numbers were nowhere near as low as Tony Abbott's were. Those were the reasons he was more of a distraction, though. There's an argument here that Tony Abbott won't be as much of a distraction as Kevin Rudd was for the Labor Party over those 2 years.
Well, maybe. You know, that's for the commentators to assess. But to date, whenever Tony Abbott has made a significant speech overseas or published opinion pieces, it's attracted a lot of attention. That distracts from the government's message. It distracts from Malcolm Turnbull's message. And so, in a way, it affects the way the government operates. Today, there's talk in the newspapers about the need for Australia to become a republic. We should become a republic. It's 246 years now since Captain Cook landed at Botany Bay. It's time for an Australian to be head of state, but I doubt that Malcolm Turnbull would have the courage to embark upon that debate when he's got a Conservative former Prime Minister and arch-monarchist in Tony Abbott still sitting in the Parliament, poised to strike and undermine and attack wherever he can.
Jason Clare, you might be right about that, but just help me understand that. What is the difference, really, between a former Prime Minister still in his 50s deciding to continue his political career versus, for example, on your side, two former Deputy Prime Ministers who have chosen to continue their political careers, Anthony Albanese and Wayne Swan? I mean, that must make life incredibly hard for Bill Shorten. At least Malcolm Turnbull has the kudos of being Prime Minister. Bill Shorten has to put up with two people that have held higher office than him, continuing to linger in the Parliament.
I guess 2 points, Peter. The key difference here is the history between Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull. They were warriors against each other at university. They fought against each other on the Republic referendum. Tony Abbott struck him down as leader of the opposition. Now Malcolm Turnbull has struck him down to become Prime Minister. So there's a lot of bad blood between the two individuals.
There's similar history, isn't there? I mean, Bill Shorten joined with Wayne Swan against Anthony Albanese in the first challenge, Rudd v Gillard. Then he switched sides and joined with Anthony Albanese against Wayne Swan in the second challenge. There's a history there too.
I'm talking about two individuals here who've got a long history, and that's why it inevitably, Peter, will be a distraction. But can I make one other constructive point here, and that is that I don't think Australia invests enough in making use of its former Prime Ministers. You're right to say Tony Abbott is still young and still can make a terrific contribution to Australia, unlike the United States, which goes out of its way to make sure that former presidents play a role for the public good. We don't do a good enough job in that respect in Australia. And I think it's a worthy debate to have in Australia about how we could use our former Prime Ministers better.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. Maybe that's something that this will elicit further down the track with any luck. Let's move to your portfolio area if we can. Mitch Fifield was extolling your virtues last week here on Newsday. He was talking about how intelligent and rational you were, great to deal with, and he's very hopeful that between you and him you can come up with a bipartisan package on media reform. Do you take the praise as a sign that there's a lot of genuine interest here in reform from the government?
Well, they're nice things to say, and it's indicative that you don't need to be spiteful or bitter or personal in politics. You can be constructive and work well with people from different sides of politics. I did that with Malcolm Turnbull when he was the Communications Minister, and hope to do that with Mitch as well. That doesn't mean that we'll always agree. We've got very strong differences of opinions on the NBN, for example. In this area, though, I think that it's incumbent on both sides to work constructively here and judge the issues on their merits.
I asked Jason Clare because he seemed to be suggesting pretty strongly that his starting point was that the reach rules are antiquated and should change, and the 2 out of 3 rule is antiquated and should change, albeit with the obvious caveat that you need to have certain protections in the legislative mix for what you do going forward, particularly, for example, for regional Australia. Are you essentially on the same page on that?
Well, on the reach rule, I've said to you before, and I've said to other journalists, that there's a very strong case to remove the reach rule. It doesn't make sense in the 21st century that Channel 9, Channel 7 or Channel 10 can only broadcast to 75% of the country, but they can stream to 100% of the country, and they do now. So that looks right for reform. We proposed it in government, and it's the sort of thing that I'd expect the government to bring forward. There's a bit of a blue going on, I think, inside the government at the moment between the Liberal Party and the National Party on how to protect local content. So we're waiting for that to be resolved so we can see that legislation come forward.
And the 2 out of 3 side of things, I mean, that's sort of in a sense another issue here, and for a lot of media companies it's the big issue because of the impact it can have on whether they can take over other sectors within the broader industry. What's your view on that?
Well, I've got an open mind and I've said that many times. We'll wait for the legislation to come forward. I'd expect that it would go to a parliamentary committee and they would flesh out all of the arguments for and against. I told Richo in an interview just before Christmas that I could come up with some very strong arguments to keep the 2 out of 3 rule in place, but I could also come up with some strong arguments to remove it. So it's a balance there. What's more important is its scale and
so
the
that's
capacity
the tougher
of... Yeah, well, in terms of the arguments being forward to remove that rule, the arguments being put by media companies are the ability to scale up, to create, in effect, a vertically integrated business where you've got newspapers, radio and television. But on the other side, if diversity is of primary importance, making sure that we've got as much diversity of ownership as well as diversity of content, then you might weigh on the side of keeping it. But the important point I'm putting forward here, Peter, is that we need to take an open mind to the debate and hear all of those arguments, not just from the government, not just from the media companies, but from all the Australian people. And
just one quick final one. We spoke to Scott Morrison yesterday on Australian Agenda. You and he have been quite close, despite being on opposite sides of the parliamentary divide. I don't know if you saw the interview or not, but it sounded to me, and Paul Kelly's written about this in the Australian today, like the strongest indication yet that the government is planning to make perhaps substantial change on the GST. Your side is a bit divided on this. Jay Weatherill has been very outspoken. Is there any chance that the Labor Party federally will open its mind to reform of the GST?
Well, I think the Treasurer's comments yesterday made it very clear that at the next election the government will propose to increase the GST. If you want the GST increased, you can vote Liberal at the next election. If you don't want the GST increased, if you don't want to be paying thousands of dollars more in GST, then you have the opportunity to vote Labor.
What about framing it this way? If you want income tax cuts at the next election, you can vote for the Liberals. If you don't want them, you can vote for the Labor Party.
Well, I think there was a story in the paper last year that said the average family will pay $8,700 in GST if the government bumps that up to 15%. And this argument, Peter, that they say we're going to compensate people, I've just got to make a point on that. because whilst they're saying they'll compensate people for the GST, there's legislation in the Parliament right now that would rip hundreds of dollars and in some cases thousands of dollars off Australian families. 20,000 families in my electorate alone will lose a lot of money. So on the one hand, they're promising to compensate for the GST, but right now they're ripping money away from Australian families. So they're being a bit tricky. They're being a little bit tricky here.
Nice little early sign perhaps of the Labor scare campaign that could be coming if they embark on GST reform. We're going to have to leave it there. Jason Clare, always appreciate your time on Newsday. Thanks again.
Thanks, Pete.